You have an influx of people who have just experienced something really horrible happen to them. And people who are interpreting for them or translating for them will be experiencing that vicarious trauma.
Audiovisual translation is not exactly a shrinking market.
By 2025, more than 650 million people in India will watch some form of online video daily.
And welcome to SlatorPod, everyone. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Florian.
So quick news check-in today, Anna, but we also have a great show today with Mila Golovine, President and CEO of MasterWord. So we talk about her successful language service and language access business based in Texas, but we also discussed a very important topic of stress and trauma that some interpreters experience in their job. So very, very interesting discussion with Mila. Today on the agenda, just want to kind of do a quick debrief from an MT meetup I attended this week, where we talked briefly about RWS's results again, and a protest in the UK around closures of a university program. And then you'll be walking us through a couple of fundraisers by AI or machine dubbing companies. But remember that we have SlatorCon remote coming up on June 29th. Fantastic agenda. So you're going to be presenting on a panel, right, Anna?
Yes, we're going to be looking into SaaS localization, and the theme is thinking globally.
So yeah, Anna, you're going to be on a panel and with software localization. So looking forward with Asana and Qualtrics. And then, of course, we have Marco Trompetti, CEO of Translated.com. We have a panel with Aqualot and MemSource. We have Tarjama talking about some of their solutions. We have a fantastic discussion with the president of Iuna SDI Group, Mark Howarth, and Disney. Andrew Hearn, the VP of Distribution Operations at Disney, is joining us. And we have Expedia Group and Payoneer, and then Andrew's closing it. So, do not miss this. This is one of the, really a very, very strong lineup we have here. So, hey, Anna, I was at a meetup this week in person.
Oh, and where was that?
That was here in Zurich. So meetups are coming back. I was in a room with 100 people. And the topic was low resource MT. And it was hosted by Tech Shuttle, a Zurich-based kind of MT as a managed service company. This was their 10th meetup. Like, they're doing a meetup like on the actual Meetup app. And it was very, very successful pre-COVID. And now I think this might have been the second or third after COVID, or maybe the second only. So it came back. A lot of people. It's basically become like the informal kind of translation meetup in Zurich. It's always like 100 people. There was sold out or booked out because it's actually free to attend, right? And so this week was super interesting because it was basically about low resource NMT, but not in a theoretical sense, right? In a kind of dry sense, but actually they presented a case study, which as a Swiss was a little close to my heart. I mean, it was about the Romansh, this, language in Switzerland, the fourth Swiss national language.
Whereabouts in Switzerland is it spoken?
I actually don't know what it's called in English. It's called, let me see. Graubünden in Swiss or in German. I think Grisons. I'm reading this off Wikipedia. Grisons. It's the southeast, basically, right? So it's spoken in the southeast of Switzerland, and it's spoken by, I think it's understood by about 100,000 people. It's spoken regularly by about 40,000. And now it's... I might have mentioned this on the pod before, but it has 5 different variants within those 40,000 speakers. So they have this kind of artificially created kind of pan-Romansh standard language they created, Romansh Grijoun. But again, actually, these 5 different variants are kind of standalone, quite different from each other. Anyway, so there is a part of the Swiss kind of national broadcast organization is focused on content that's exclusively in Romansh, and they engaged with Tech Shuttle on a MT project because they're basically MT. There was no MT for Romansh.
Yeah, perfect example of a low resource language.
100%, right? So it was super interesting because they talked about. I mean, first, let me start with this. Like a couple of PhD students, Chantal Amrein and Noemi Epley from the University of Zurich, computational linguistics. They kind of gave the setting around kind of problems and possible solutions for low resource NMT or MT, right? So it was kind of a theoretical beginning, but then and it was very interesting. Like some of the key challenges you have, it's not just about the amount of data, it's about how you kind of, curate the data and like really went into kind of niche semantic and kind of vocab problems as well. But then they moved on to this case study with the Romansh kind of unit of the Swiss broadcasting company. And it was interesting because they had to really kind of come up with the data first. There was no kind of reference data, no parallel data, right? So they had to OCR a bunch of old materials. They had to kind of go and speech to text a lot of old news shows. I think they had a fair amount of reference material from like some of the website, but they still had to align it, etc. So long story short, they then build a Romansh engine, which is now really helping in kind of day-to-day operations. To just give you one example, agency news, right? So when you do a news show in Romansh, you basically need to read this off like the news feed, like the Reuters news feed, for example, that's coming in English, right? And it's literally like hundreds, probably, I don't know, maybe per minute or per hour. It's just a lot of kind of agency news coming in. And if you have to kind of, as a news speaker, as a reporter, if you have to mentally translate this into your head, into Romansh all the time, it's very taxing and it's time consuming. So now they're emptying that kind of Reuters news feed or that news feed, and that takes a lot of the kind of the mental pressure of the journalists to then put together the show. All right. Textual, if I butchered this, I'm sorry, but this was one of the use cases that I remember. So very, very interesting MT meetup there. And it was just good to catch up with a lot of old friends from the industry. So that's good news. Bad news in the UK, where the University of Roehampton has announced proposed staff cuts, the third since 2020, and this time also the university's audiovisual translation program experiences a fair amount of cuts. And then the UK Subtitlers Association, Subtle, has kind of launched an online petition to stop the cuts and really fights back, saying that, audiovisual translation is not exactly a shrinking market, as we will see in the Disney Iuna presentation. It's quite the opposite, right? So why would you cut that part where basically the industry is scrambling for resources? So head over to Slator.com and check the story. But it's quite the quite the pushback there from them. Probably can't do much about it, I'm assuming, but because it's kind of a nationwide cut that's coming in from the UK government. Very, very briefly, we did cover RWS's result. No major surprises. The revenues are at like $466 million US. That's for 6 months, right? So they're like on track to hit the billion if nothing spectacular happens. Profits up 20% at $75 million US. So overall, they're going to generate like 150 million in the year. Now, if you look at actually their organic growth, it's a little slower if you kind of factor out all of the Forex and the kind of acquisition related things. So it's more like 1 or 2% organic growth. So quite modest, but they're also launching their language experience delivery, which we talked to Maria about, kind of a unified platform where they have all these different, technology platforms that they have. They did say they're experiencing growth in their SaaS suite. Like, a lot of the Trados products have now moved to SaaS. They got Trident, the Contenta, they got the Language Weaver brand, which is obviously SaaS. So the whole thing has generated roughly 67 million in revenues. That's a growth of 2%. After last week's podcast with Matt Hauser, I think it might be neck and neck, or maybe TransPerfect is a little bit ahead in terms of the kind of overall tech sales in the language industry. But those two are definitely the biggest players if you look at combined language technology revenues, like TransPerfect RWS that is. And one dampening factor remains that IP, the patent business, patent translation business, which accounts for 15% of revenues at RWS and has declined by 8% because of the unitary patent that will kind of dampen demand in that space. All right, that's RWS. Anna, now tell us about machine dubbing. There's a couple of, we'll refer to it as machine dubbing, right? Could be AI dubbing.
Yeah, we had two recent stories relating to machine dubbing. One of them was about an Indian startup called Dubverse. It raised $800,000 in a seed round. So this is an India-based platform. It was founded just last year in 2021. The founders had the idea back in 2020 during lockdown. And it offers real-time automated dubbing for videos into 10 Indian languages and 20 what they call world languages. And they're mainly targeting, content creators for video, marketers, digital agencies, both short form content and long form content. And the use cases that they highlight include e-learning, edtech, documentaries, product explainers, and so on.
So it's not really media, like entertainment media.
It's more online video content is where they're really looking at. And so you can kind of copy and paste a YouTube link or upload a video there. And you basically just select a voice, select a target language, hit dub, and then it will produce a target version for you.
Which you did.
Which I did. We tested this on a SlatorPod, actually our SlatorPod episode with Maria Schnell from RWS. And what did you think of the results into German?
It was okay. It was started out very strong. So it was what was it, like a 90-second clip, right? And it was okay. It started out well. Then it kind of in the end that there were like quite a few kind of mistranslations, and the voice is the kind of classic German synthetic female voice. Now, obviously that's not bad, but it's more of a voiceover in my view than like dubbing, right? Because there's no lip syncing or anything, so it's like automated voiceover in my view. But yeah, it's free.
They offer, options to tweak the transcript or the translated transcript afterwards. And they also offer the option to reach out to their kind of crowdsource target language reviewer to refine that output. So yeah, this technology, it's AI based. They didn't reveal the details of the underlying tech, but one of the co-founders, talked about machine translation, speech synthesis, and referred to GPT-3 as well. And they're going to use the funds to further develop the product. So the main investor was Kalari Capital, and they're a tech-focused venture capital firm. They shared some interesting data points about the market in India, how they see this, talking about the video user base in India growing at 24% annually. By 2025, more than 650 million people in India will watch some form of online video daily. And they also highlighted this increase in short form video. So India has a couple of different short form video platforms, as well as, of course, using TikTok, which is the more globally used platform. And yeah, just this theme, again, that we see everywhere, actually, this increasing demand for local content for local and regional languages. So they cited a report from Google KPMG that found that 70% of people in India find local language digital content more reliable. And there was also a stat there, I can't remember, but advertising is more effective when in the local language as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe English, German, and then have me evaluate this is probably too high of a bar. I mean, if you're in, this is probably one of the most high resource combinations, but also I'm totally spoiled. Again, my whole life I've been consuming dubbed content that was perfectly lip synced with like a 70-year-old tradition, right? So, but of course, if you speak, well, maybe a non like fix or maybe Chinese, Japanese language, and you're not really used to consuming a lot of content in your local language. I mean, I think this could be great, right? I mean, even though it's not perfect on all metrics yet, but this opens up a gigantic new universe of content to people who previously probably had very few like native language options.
Yeah, exactly. That's how the co-founders explained their original motivation.
Good. All right, then another one. Our friends over at Papercup. We had them on the podcast.
Yeah, we had CEO Jesse Sherman on the podcast a while ago. So they're London-based, again, an AI dubbing startup. They raised $20 million US in an oversubscribed round, which closed in May. So more investors wanted in than could be accommodated. And it was a Series A round, brought the total funding for Papercup to $34 million US. And we spoke to head of growth Amir Jibandi, and he said he talked about the way that they see their solution is being used beyond the realms of traditional dubbing. So kind of automating types of content that would not normally have a localization budget attached. So one of the questions that came up was how would Papercup account for successfully raising funds at this particular moment in time? And they talked about the fact that though the solution is very much AI based, it's human in the loop innovation. So the human part of the process is very crucial as well to their operating model. They use feedback from QAs, going back into the workflow to refine the voice, professional translators doing quality checks, and then kind of adding nuances, emphasis, and inflections to try and get that speech to sound as natural as possible.
And one of the interesting parts here is really that I also put that in last week's newsletter. I mean, basically, a lot of the startup funding ecosystem is completely frozen, right, over the past 4 to 8 weeks as like interest rates shoot up and, like just general turmoil in financial markets. The fact that Papercup was able to raise money in this environment, and I don't think this was a round that was like closed like in December and announced now, at least not as far as I remember. This actually did close kind of after all the disruptions have started, is a very strong indicator that this is that investors remain very bullish on this sector, right? I mean, like if you're in a lot of other sectors, you're not going to be able to raise right now. I mean, or it's going to be very, very tough. So I think this is a kind of a vote of confidence from the VC community that they see this business as having a strong future.
Yeah, they're still attracting a lot of interest.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, so don't forget to register for SlatorCon remote, and let's head over to Mila. And here we are again. Really happy to have Mila Golovine join us today. So Mila is the president and CEO of MasterWord, the language service and language access provider based in Texas, right?
Yes, thank you for having me.
So Mila, does this podcast find you in Texas today?
I am in Texas, experiencing one of the hottest summers again.
That's what I'm hearing on the Twitter. So, well, same here. It's not the hottest ever, but it's getting there. So, Mila, tell us a bit about your background, and then you've been in the industry for a couple of decades. So, how did you transition? How did you come into this language industry? I mean, I did my research, you studied finance at university. So how does a finance graduate join the language industry?
I know, quite confusing. So I always had a love for languages. I've been studying English and French as I was growing up, and I always wanted to connect people. I grew up in the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain with lack to information, and so always wanted to find ways to connect people to information. So when I was fortunate enough to come here, after right when things opened up during Gorbachev times, I started studying finance, and I took a class that I really had no clue what it was about, but it was an elective at a convenient time called entrepreneurship. And we had a homework assignment to write a business plan. And as a good student, it was last minute, the night before. And the one thing I could think about was a language company. So little did I know that I would then have it for the rest of the semester and then the rest of the program. So, and there we are. I ended up falling in love with the idea, the concept, and here we are years later.
So homework assignment turns into a 2.5, 3 decade career so far.
Yes.
Fantastic. So tell me, so from there, from like the homework assignment from the first semester there, what's the origin story of MasterWord? What's the story behind the name? And you know, how do you kind of get things started there? Maybe just walk us through some of the key milestones. I mean, must have been a lot over the past 2 to 3 decades.
Well, actually, the story behind the name is also another funny story. I was originally freelancing, doing some interpreting work, and we were working for was working for one of the very large oil and gas companies, and a client. We were discussing the next assignment, and then the client kind of opened the door, peeped his head, and said, "Legal says we can no longer work with individuals." And I said, "Okay, we'll incorporate." And he then puts his head in, goes, "What's the company name?" And I first said Microsoft. He said, "Doesn't work." And and then I said, okay, MasterWord. He said, okay. And so that's how the name came up at the spur of the moment, just without any thought.
That's the best. I think a lot of people tend to overthink this a lot more and, go into all kinds of brainstorming sessions. So you were lucky to have this part ticked off relatively quickly.
Very quickly. It was seconds.
Tell us a bit more. Like, so you started like from, the route from basically a business plan, freelance, like incorporate because the companies, they can't work with individuals sometimes. So then like, what was the first milestone in your view? How did it kind of evolve from there?
So originally when I started, the first employee used to come for a paycheck at the end of every day because that's how much confidence she had that would still be in business tomorrow. And started, of course, just with Russian, then expanded into Spanish, started focusing on oil and gas. And those of us who follow the oil and gas a little bit, it's more like a roller coaster. So it was one of those roller coaster declines in the late 90s. And we ended up surviving that decline. And then I said, let's diversify. So we diversified into healthcare and to government. And actually, I ended up falling in love with that sector because of the impact that we have on people's lives, helping them gain access to healthcare, education, government services. So we do a lot of work today with that sector.
So you talked about the cyclicality of your client industries. So I would assume right now, things are very strong in the energy sector. I mean, prices are very, very high at the moment.
It tends to be when there is a massive recession, then the oil and gas sector is doing really well. And so the normally it's kind of like off cycle. But what we try to focus on is staying in the industries that are going to recessions at opposite times. So that helps. That helps keeping things more stable. At one point, when we were very heavily focused on oil and gas, it was a much bigger roller coaster.
What type of work do you do for oil and gas? I mean, my background is more kind of the finance side, so I can imagine that. But what does oil and gas need language services for?
A lot of work, typical things when you work internationally, your marketing content, but also a lot of regulatory content and health, safety, environment content, or training. When you go work overseas and the workforce doesn't speak English, or so regulatory and compliance work.
Got it. Yeah, I vaguely remember that. I think Norway had it almost kind of as a national project to kind of translate the entire oil and gas terminology back in the 60s because they were afraid that that kind of Norwegian was gonna just get steamrolled by all this English terminology when they started to build up their oil and gas industry. So yeah, I guess regulatory is a big part there as well. Sorry, I'm coming here with a 1960s anecdote, but I remember that. And so you then so oil and gas, energy, and healthcare. You mentioned healthcare. Can we just dwell a little bit more on the healthcare side and what type of work you do there?
The healthcare, education, government. So it's working with doing a lot of work with limited English proficiency and deaf and hard of hearing individuals, or rather we work with large healthcare systems, education systems, schools, universities, or courts, providing access to services. So it's people walking in who don't speak the language and want to understand their doctor, or parents, parent-teacher meetings, or court type settings. So it's a lot of interpreting, but also it's a lot of associated written work.
What's interesting for us Europeans that operate in mostly state-owned healthcare systems, can you just tell us a bit more how this works in the U.S., maybe Texas specifically? Like, who kind of procures the language services? What are the drivers there? I understand there's kind of the language access framework, but then at the end of the day, it's basically outsourced by private companies. So how does that work?
The procurement is done for healthcare by hospital systems, or again, court systems, or education organizations. So you have, they do the procurement. It's largely done through the RFP process, and then they pay for the services. And the drivers are the outcomes, right? You have for healthcare systems, there's a lot of issues involved. Like, for example, Medicare reimbursement depends on the so-called HCAP scores, which means patient satisfaction, which is largely driven by communication, and also depends on readmission rates within the first 30 days. And what happens is, if there's miscommunication happens, people come back. And so hospitals are trying to reduce the readmission rates, improve patient satisfaction as a result of that, and also errors. If you don't speak the language, it leads to real serious medical mistakes, surgeries done incorrectly, or other things happening. And for schools, it's driven by, if parents are involved, then you have better outcomes in terms of graduation for kids. A lot of parents can't be involved if they don't speak the language. And then you also have kids coming into the system that don't speak the language, or deaf and hard of hearing population. They need an interpreter throughout the entire education setting. And then, of course, in courts, you need an interpreter during the court proceeding. And I think that's typical in all parts of the world.
What's your language mix like? I would assume in Texas it's very much overwhelmingly Spanish.
It's a lot of Spanish, and it depends. It's actually a lot of Spanish all over the U.S., but then it depends on the demographic and the refugee population. And so at one point, Burmese was one of the top requested languages. Depending on the part of the country, it may be Marshallese. We're seeing a lot more Mayan languages right now. So a lot of languages of limited diffusion that come in, a lot of Dari, a lot of languages from Afghanistan. So it's largely driven by the refugee population coming in. But the top languages are always English, Vietnamese, Arabic, that require interpreters or translation. I'm sorry, Spanish, not English. Spanish, Vietnamese, Arabic.
Well, I mean, you could argue it's back and forth. So talk about these languages of limited diffusion, lesser diffusion. Like, how do you recruit, train these interpreters? I mean, there's probably less of an established framework. There's not a very deep pool of interpreters in that.
There's none. So we, as a result, have built a team that focuses solely on recruiting. So we're recruiting all the time. And we do a lot of work with different refugee communities. And then when we find people who are absolutely fluent in English in their native language, then it's training. So we have a number of training courses, training for healthcare, medical interpreters. We just completed recently a brand new course for educational interpreters, how to work in the legal setting, how do you interpret during a rape investigation versus in a psychiatric setting versus in pediatric setting. And all of that needs to be explained and taught. Understanding of the U.S. medical system, right? What is the concept of confidentiality? Because it's different from country to country. So all of that, we have a lot of training courses that we run and that we offer to interpreters.
Actually, I was going to touch on that. Like, this is the MasterWord Institute, right? Is that going through that?
We are forming that. We operate it as part of our training and assessments team, and we're actually have just launched MasterWord Institute, and that's more like vocational training. So that's not to take away from any of the universities, but this is for the people that are stepping into a profession, need to understand what's going on. Among the refugees, there are amazing people among the refugees. You see doctors, you see lawyers, you see engineers, you see teachers, people who have very high level of education in their own country that have been displaced by war or have been displaced by some kind of tragedy. At the same time, sometimes we see percentages of population, and right now I'm dealing with, especially coming out from speakers of my language, they're actually functionally illiterate. So that's a completely different problem. And the Mayan alphabet has not been digitized. Some of the language, they're sometimes using Latin alphabet, sometimes not, but speakers coming out of those smaller communities don't speak Spanish and they don't speak English, and they can't read. And so in Spanish or English, right? So that's a completely different challenge to have.
So just for the listeners that are maybe not so familiar with that, like a Mayan language would be mostly Central America, right?
Guatemala, there are 25 languages that are rather distinct and different.
Yeah. I do remember I traveled there literally in the late 90s, and once you get into the mountains, then the Spanish becomes a little less used. Yeah, interesting that this would still be the case. For the Institute, though, how do we think about that? So was that an internal program you had, and then you decided, well, we kind of do this for our own kind of recruiting purposes, and let's kind of institutionalize this a bit more? Or was it more kind of hey, we have a blank sheet of paper and we're doing this kind of from scratch? Or how do we think about the development of this?
We're doing this from scratch. What is the need? And looking at it as what is the need in the US and what is the need globally? Somebody who, looking at a person who wants to start working as an interpreter, there's no programs that exist. It's a marginalized language. And can I work as an interpreter, right? What are the things that I need to know? What are the things that I need to learn? And then the other part of that, we're looking at helping interpreters with additional skills that they may need.
I think it's a great initiative. It's somewhere between, as I said, kind of as you said, like the academic side of things. But for this one, for these particular communities, it's probably not something universities would offer at this point.
Correct. And so we're not looking at replacing the training for simultaneous interpreters. This is the training for community interpreters. This is the training for somebody who's going to be stepping in and working as an interpreter in a war zone or a social services setting, and for their community, just to understand the better skills to be a better interpreter. And you know that there is a lot of mistakes that can be made. If you don't know what you difference between being bilingual and being an interpreter, everybody in our industry knows, but it's kind of like a difference between repairing a car and driving a car. I can drive a car, but I may not know how to repair it. So what are these basic skills that somebody needs to be able to be a better interpreter?
Got it. And you did mention before that there's obviously various very difficult, stressful, kind of traumatic situations that interpreters might find themselves in. We recently published an article on this where you also contributed to on the topic of like stress and vicarious trauma among language professionals. So can you just tell us a bit more about how you define vicarious trauma. Why are language professionals, like in the healthcare, legal, social settings, at greater risk, and what can they do to kind of address it, overcome it?
So it's a big problem. And first of all, it's a problem that hasn't been recognized. Interpreters have been working solo, right? And translators actually are affected by it as well. And so what happens is that happened to me. I actually, in 2006, found myself not knowing, what's going on, but I've been doing a lot of assignments working with victims of domestic violence or human trafficking. And then I found myself actually experiencing that. So I thought I was going crazy. And I started seeing actually a therapist. I found myself in a self-help section. So as I learned about it, it's a result of the trauma that we're exposed to. About 100% of the people exposed to trauma are affected by it. Now, 60 to 70% bounce right back, no problem. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie and you see somebody's legs being cut off in a movie, you kind of suddenly are touching your own legs. You feel the pain. You cringe, right, when you're sitting in the movie. Or you experience the fear of a character in the movie. So, but what happens if you're exposed to that trauma over and over? Interpreters and translators, we fall into that other 30 to 40%. And it's taking on somebody else's trauma. So what happens to us is we witness the trauma, we're taking it on, then we process it cognitively. We hear it in one language, we have to find a linguistic equivalent in another, and then for an interpreter, it comes out in the first person. I have been raped, I have 6 months to live, whatever that is. Or for a translator, it comes out kinesthetically as they type it or they write it. So what happens is we then end up in a way channeling the trauma through us cognitively and then in some way physically. And it leaves a very large residue. It leaves, you almost have the experience of that other person, but you put it on top of your own experience. So now it becomes yours. And it actually affects us physically. It affects our body physiologically. It affects us epigenetically. There's been some studies made that on survivors of Holocaust that shows that trauma affects us epigenetically and sometimes carries all the way to 5 to 14 generations, depending on the studies that have been made. So it has pretty severe and serious effects. And so I started diving into the subject, wanted to educate us as language professionals about, hey, that exists. And then also, what can we do? And we heard about the interpreters going deaf, right? Some simultaneous interpreters going deaf. And I wish I could connect like the people doing that study and the people doing research on, vicarious trauma and effects of trauma, because part of that is trauma. Part of it is what's called going outside of the window of tolerance. And as they have been exposed to a lot of negative information in addition to going on Zoom and everything.
What are some of the ways that interpreters, let's kind of narrow it to interpreters, that they can cope with this, that can address it? Like what kind of support should they get to be able to continue their profession, right? But also, of course, avoid trauma.
Very interesting. And again, some steps are very simple, and they will go for everybody who's exposed to trauma, whether you're interpreter, translator, or just there in the middle of things. And there are certain things that we can do before, during, and after. So what we can do during is when you're experiencing some form of level of stress, there's a very quick thing that you can do. You're reacting in your subconscious mind. You're reacting in your amygdala. You're not able, so you're not even thinking about it. But your body will give you feedback, whether that's a knot in your throat or your stomach, or you feel like throwing up, or you have some kind of hot flash or cold flash. As soon as you realize that you are affected by what you're seeing or what you're reading, then just naming that emotion reduces the stress level by 50%. So just acknowledging, even in your mind, that I am scared, I am disgusted, I'm overwhelmed, whatever that is, reduces the emotion because it moves it from subconscious to prefrontal cortex. So just acknowledging the emotion. Another thing that we can do is manage things through breath. And when some of you hear people take you, oh, just take a deep breath, right? Or there is a lot of wisdom behind it. So when we are facing trauma, we activate the fight or flight system, right? That immediate response, the stress response. But breath activates the opposite. If fight or flight is like the gas pedal, then breath activates the so-called vagus nerve, the rest and digest system. And what happens is it's like your brake pedal. And it's actually a deep exhale that activates it. So if you inhale just normally, but you exhale very deeply, like you're blowing out candles on your grandma's 100th birthday cake, that immediately activates that rest and digest system. And you'll even feel like some weird sensation going on. That's the opposite chemical reaction happening in your body. So just two things to remember: name the emotion, and then the deep exhale, and just breathing deeply will help you calm down in the moment. And then after that, you can do, a lot of things. One of them, I think one of the most useful things can be just forming a support group. The chaplains who deal with a lot of difficult situations all the time, they actually have a concept of a debrief partner, where you set the time limit. You say, can you be my debrief partner for 20 minutes, 30 minutes? And then in a way, one is involved in active listening, and the other one is involved in actively sharing, but not what happened, nothing confidential about the case, right? But what happened to you. I have just had a very strong emotional reaction. I felt like, I don't know, throwing up, but not sharing, not breaking any confidentiality, talking about yourself and your experience in the situation. That helps a lot.
Are there particular communities of interpreters that are kind of more at risk than others in this?
If you work in legal setting, you end up going to, and suddenly you're in a death trial, right? Or you're suddenly in your trial with child abuse. It depends on what is and it depends on your past experience, what will trigger you, right? Healthcare setting, end of life, or let's say you're a woman and you just lost a child, you had a miscarriage, and suddenly you're interpreting it's somebody's childbirth, right? It can trigger your emotional reaction. But end of life in healthcare settings. So pretty much everything outside of your regular business, right? and marketing. Anytime you work with human beings, you may experience that.
How does the modality work? I would assume most of this is being done in person, right? Or what are you seeing? Does it matter if it's on Zoom or not?
It doesn't matter even if it's telephonic, because we as human beings, when you read a book, you see a picture. So we react to other person's trauma, and we put it on top of what we heard before, what we saw in movies, how we were affected. Right now in Europe, we have a lot of refugees from Ukraine, people coming out from horrific experiences. We also have refugees from Syria who came out from horrific experiences, and then Afghanistan. So you have an influx of people who have just experienced something really horrible happen to them. And people who are interpreting for them or translating for them or interacting with them in any way will be experiencing that vicarious trauma and reliving that just through the stories themselves.
Maybe to just move on to the kind of that discussion around like modality, OPI, VRI, RSI. How do you see it as in your business? Like, have we kind of found somewhat of an equilibrium post-COVID? Are things still moving towards the remote side of things, or what do you see?
So during COVID, there's actually been another modality born called virtual interpreting. And what they found during COVID is that VRI didn't work because VRI assumed that the doctor and the patient were in the same room. And during COVID, that was not always the case. And then you may have had family members in another room. So now virtual interpreting is what connects through any platform that's out there. FaceTime, Zoom, I don't know, Google Duo, anything that's there, but that request has to be pre-scheduled. It cannot be on demand. But it can be pre-scheduled very quickly, 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and you can, depending on the language, right, you connect the interpreter. So all of these modalities during COVID, everything went to remote interpreting. Pretty much 90% of requests went to a virtual type platform. Now there's a lot more requests for in person again. And it kind of depends on the community. It kind of depends on the hospital system, and it depends on the demographic. Believe it or not, I think kids are more comfortable with virtual modalities than adults. So it'll be an interesting shift that we see a few years down the road. And there are also some settings for smaller communities because in-person interpreters, there may be a lot of familiarity within smaller communities. So they're actually more comfortable with a remote setting because then they're not speaking to somebody they know.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Again, it depends on the community. It depends on the setting. But a lot of the people who are, in their 40s and 50s, they're a lot more comfortable with in-person than remote. But kids are the opposite.
Kids are the opposite. Well, they were made to kind of like remote, and over the past 2 years, right? For some of them, it's been like a third of their life, right?
Even before that, they'd be coming in, sitting at a table and communicating through Instagram with each other.
From Instagram to regulations, I just want to briefly touch on, like, how do you see the regulatory side of things evolving in the US? Like, language access seems to be here to stay. I mean, do you see any changes on the horizon? Do you feel not much? It's going to kind of remain steady for the next decade or so?
I think language access is here to stay. I think there's a very solid movement for language access. And if you take away the humanitarian part, there's also the financial part. Better graduation rates for kids whose parents are involved, less wasted time in court proceedings, better and more efficient way of working with patients. And language access is definitely here to stay.
Is it very different, again, for the those outside the US, is it very different state by state, despite this being a federal regulation, as far as I understand, or is it very kind of broadly somewhat harmonized?
It's broadly harmonized across the states, but it is different state by state. It depends on what I guess we can call the maturity of the client in a way. You have still a lot of hospital systems and organizations that would call a family member or that would call an ad hoc interpreter, what's called. More and more people are educated that, if you're calling a family member to interpret for a kid who is confessing about, sexual abuse, and maybe that won't happen, or the accuracy of interpreting by a family member in a healthcare setting. Even if it's perfectly accurate, the patient may not share full information, which is needed for treatment.
Tell us a bit more about, like, what are your plans over the next kind of couple of years, 2 to 3 key initiatives for you, for MasterWord, for the Institute? Anything you can share with us?
What we're focusing on is growing all sides of the business, right? We have a very strong translation localization side, and we're growing there. We're very strong with life sciences. We're very strong with just working with the commercial sector, and that expands beyond oil and gas. We're doing a lot of work there, and we're looking at growing kind of more or less balanced across the verticals. And, of course, healthcare, education, legal as supporting courts, and then insurance, finance. That's the sectors we're focusing on. And across both lines, translation, localization, and then the spoken language. We want to be kind of having lived through a number of recessions, looking at how different sectors and actually even different verticals go in and out of recession at different times.
Yeah, and let's see if we're heading into another one. There's talk that we're already in a recession, at least in the US and in parts of Europe. So I think it's a wise decision to be quite diversified in terms of your client setup there.
Oil and gas industry is doing fantastic right now.
Yeah. some others aren't doing fantastic. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that was fascinating. Thanks so much, Mila, for taking the time today and doing the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.